Open the door to America's past, the first episode of a 12-part journey. Imagine standing inside the entire timeline of American history. You step off a wooden ship onto this continent in the year 1607. The air is thick with salt from the Atlantic. Behind you, the ocean stretches endlessly. Ahead lies a wilderness of towering pines and untamed rivers. You are one of the first English settlers to set foot in Jamestown. Virginia, your boots sink into the muddy shore as you look around at the fragile wooden huts rising from the forest. Life here is harsh. Food is scarce. Winter is unforgiving. But you stay, because this land holds the promise of something new, something greater than the life you left behind. The years pass. You travel north to Plymouth, Massachusetts, where you watch weary settlers share their first harvest feast with the Wampanoag people. The moment will one day be remembered as Thanksgiving. You journey along the coast as 13 colonies begin to grow. You hear whispers of resentment against the distant British Crown. New taxes, new restrictions, new laws. In Boston's narrow streets, you can feel the tension building like a storm, and then it explodes. It is 1775. You hear the crack of muskets at Lexington and Concord. You run with farmers and shopkeepers who have become soldiers overnight. You stand in Philadelphia a year later as men sign the Declaration of Independence. Each stroke of the quill a pledge to risk everything for freedom. You cross the icy Delaware River with George Washington and his ragged army. You watch them fight in bitter winters and sweltering summers, until the British finally surrender at Yorktown in 1781. A new nation is born. But the story doesn't end there. You travel west with wagon trains, following rough trails into lands few settlers have seen. You cross rivers, mountains, and endless prairies, chasing the promise of opportunity. You witness the Trail of Tears, as entire native nations are forced from their ancestral homelands. You reach California in 1849 and see men clawing through riverbeds for gold. You ride in the first trains thundering across the continent, the tracks linking east to west in a single iron line. But as America grows, so do its divisions. You walk the cotton fields of the South and see enslaved men and women working from sunrise to sundown. At night, you follow Harriet Tubman through the woods, part of the Underground Railroad that guides the enslaved to freedom. The country splits in two. It is 1861. You stand at the edge of a battlefield as cannon fire shakes the ground. Blue and grey uniforms blur in the smoke. The Civil War has begun. You watch Abraham Lincoln write the Emancipation Proclamation by candlelight, his shoulders heavy with the weight of the nation. Years later, the guns fall silent. Slavery is abolished, but the wounds of war cut deep. You walk through towns in the South, burned and broken, where millions of newly freed people struggle to start new lives. Then the frontier calls again. You ride with cowboys on the open plains of Texas. You see the teepees of the Sioux near the Little Bighorn River. You witness the closing battles of the Wild West as the last native nations fight for their way of life. And now, the cities rise. You stand at Ellis Island in 1890, watching ships unload wave after wave of immigrants' families from Italy, Ireland, Germany, and beyond. They climb the steps with little more than hope in their hands. You walk the crowded streets of New York, Chicago, and Pittsburgh. Smokestacks blacken the sky. Factories roar day and night. You meet men like Andrew Carnegie, John D., Rockefeller, and Thomas Edison, whose ambition and invention shape the modern world. The gap between rich and poor grows wider. You march with striking workers demanding fair pay and safer conditions. You feel the heartbeat of a restless nation, one that has transformed from a handful of fragile colonies into a powerful industrial giant. And then you look up. The year is 1900. The Statue of Liberty towers above the harbor, her torch glowing in the night. America stands at the dawn of a new century, stronger than ever, but facing challenges it cannot yet imagine. All of this in just 25 minutes. This is only the beginning. In the full 12-episode series, you will step deeper into each moment, meet the people who shaped this country, and experience history as if you were truly there. Take a breath. Now open your eyes. Your journey through the history of the United States is about to begin. The attic was quiet that night. A soft rain tapped against the roof, the steady rhythm echoing through the wooden beams above your head. You had come up here looking for nothing in particular, maybe an old book, maybe just a bit of quiet. but the smell of dust and aged pine had pulled you deeper into the farthest corner. That's when you saw it. A box. Not large, maybe 18 inches long, a foot wide but carved from dark oak. With brass hinges dulled by time, it sat beneath a sheet of yellowed canvas, as if it had been waiting, patiently, for someone to find it. You crouched low and brushed your hand over the lid. The wood was cool, rough in places where the grain had splintered. A single keyhole rested at its center. Though there was no key in sight, still, when your fingers pressed against the latch, the box opened with a soft click. Inside were fragments, an old photograph, edges curling, a frayed leather-bound journal, no bigger than your palm, a brass compass, its needles spinning wildly, and at the bottom, folded into a neat square, a piece of parchment so brittle it threatened to crumble at your touch. You lifted it carefully and felt something stir in the room around you. The air grew heavier, as if the attic itself was holding its breath. That's when you heard the voice. Do you know what you're holding? It wasn't a voice you recognized. It seemed to rise from the floorboards, from the shadows in the corners of the attic. Low, steady, warm in a way that made your heart pound harder rather than calm. These are not just relics, the voice said. They're doorways. Each one will take you back to places and moments that shaped this country. If you're willing to go, you swallowed hard and looked again at the box. Doorways. But somehow, you understood. The photograph Jamestown, 1607. The journal Boston, 1773. The compass, the wide open plains of the American West. Each item belonged to a story, a fragment of a life lived long before you were born. You can turn back now, the voice continued. Close the box, go downstairs and forget you ever found it. Or you can step through. You can walk the streets where history was made. Meet the people who fought and bled and dreamed this nation into being. But know this, once you start, you won't be the same when you return. You stared at the journal again. The leather was cracked, the pages barely holding together. But as you opened it, you saw ink written in a hand that trembled words from someone long gone. We came across the ocean, hungry for a place to belong. We found danger, death, and hope. If anyone reads this, they know that we believed in tomorrow. The attic light flickered. You could almost see them now, the settlers stepping off their ships into an unknown wilderness. The sharp scent of salt water and pine filling the air. You could hear the crunch of boots on frozen ground. The creak of wooden doors in a new village that barely deserved the name. Jamestown, the first English settlement in North America, and Plymouth, where a single harvest feast would one day become a holiday Thanksgiving, celebrated in warm kitchens across the United States. You felt the attic floor tilt beneath you, as though the past itself was tugging at your feet. Close your eyes, the voice whispered. Take a breath. The year is 1607. The ocean stretches behind you, endless and grey. Ahead lies a narrow riverbank in Virginia, the trees towering 100 feet overhead, the soil rich but unbroken. This is where your story begins. Your feet hit the ground hard, the thud echoing like a heartbeat through the dense Virginia woods. The air was different here, thicker, laced with the sweet scent of pine and damp earth. Behind you, the James River stretched wide and silver under the morning sun. Ahead lay a clearing where a handful of wooden huts huddled together, smoke curling from crude chimneys. Jamestown. You could see it now, raw and fragile. The first English settlement in North America. A few dozen settlers moved slowly through the muddy street, their boots sinking deep with each step. They were gaunt from hunger, faces lined with worry. Many had left everything they knew in England: family, friends, the safety of a home to gamble their lives on this wild, unfamiliar land. A man hammered planks onto the side of a leaning cabin. His hands were cracked and bleeding, but his voice was steady as he called out to another settler to fetch more nails. Children peeked from behind the huts, wide-eyed, clutching scraps of cornbread. This was no place for the faint of heart. Disease ran rampant, crops failed. The bitter cold of winter claimed lives in the night. Yet, despite it all, they stayed. You followed the dirt path out toward the riverbank, where a young woman stood quietly, her dark hair braided neatly over her shoulder. Pocahontas. Her gaze was soft but strong, and she carried herself with a dignity that belied her youth. She was the daughter of Chief Powhatan, and though her people had every reason to distrust these strangers, she had become a bridge between two worlds, It was through her presence that uneasy truces were formed, that Jamestown survived its darkest days. The voice in your ear returned, gentle as the wind through the trees. Here it began, against impossible odds. These settlers carved out the first threads of a future nation. But this was only the beginning. The world blurred again, colours bleeding together until the ground beneath your feet shifted once more. Now you were standing on a cobblestone street in Boston. The year was 1720. The air was alive with sound horses clattering over stone, merchants calling out their wares, the hum of conversations in accents that were English, Dutch, German, French. 13 colonies now lined the eastern coast, each growing steadily more prosperous. Town squares bustled with farmers selling fresh produce, shopkeepers weighing flour and tobacco, children darting between wagons with bare feet. You stepped past a wooden church with a steeple that scraped the sky. Inside, the community gathered not just for worship, but for debate, for education, for the sheer comfort of being together. Further south, in places like Charleston, broad plantations spread for miles, fields of cotton and rice stretching to the horizon. The work was brutal, carried on the backs of enslaved Africans whose lives were bound in chains. You could feel the weight of it, the injustice that simmered quietly, a shadow on the growing colonies. "Do you see it?" the voice asked. "These people are building something, the homes, towns, dreams. But with every new law and tax imposed by the crown, they are beginning to question why they should bow to a king who lives 3,000 miles away." You caught sight of a newspaper posted outside a tavern. The headline spoke of new taxes on tea, sugar, and paper. A group of men clustered around it, anger flashing in their eyes. Boston, Philadelphia, New York, each colony was buzzing with the same question. How much control should England have over lives so far removed from London's rule? One man in a tricorn hat leaned close to another and whispered, "If they push us any further, there'll be a reckoning." The voice in your ear softened. The colonies are changing. They are no longer simply English outposts. They are becoming something American. And soon, the spark will ignite. You turn back toward the harbour. Ships bob gently in the tide, sails snapping in the cold Atlantic wind. Somewhere on those decks, shipments of taxed goods were being unloaded, and in the streets nearby, quiet meetings were already being held in dimly lit rooms. It was the calm before the storm. The world shifted once again, a low hum rising in your chest as if time itself was breathing around you. "Next," the voice whispered, "you will hear the crack of musket fire at Lexington. You will feel the weight of a nation's first fight for freedom. The revolution is coming. The revolution and a nation is born." The smell of gunpowder hit you before the sound. Then crack. A musket fired somewhere behind a stone wall, its echo rolling across the Massachusetts countryside. You dropped low as men in homespun coats sprinted past you, their faces set with fear and determination. Lexington, April 1775. The first shots of the American Revolution had just been fired. Though no one knew yet what history would call this day, farmers, blacksmiths, and shopkeepers, ordinary men who had been drilling in secret for months, were now clashing with the world's most powerful army. A red-coated British soldier barked an order, his musket fixed on a boy no older than 16. Somewhere nearby, a bell rang frantically, summoning every able-bodied man to the fight. "Do you feel it?" the voice whispered in your ear. "This is the spark that will set 13 colonies ablaze." You stumbled back from the chaos, your boots catching in the wet spring grass. Time bent. Now you were in Philadelphia, the summer air thick with heat and debate. A grand brick building loomed before you, Independence Hall, its tall windows glowing with candlelight well past midnight. Inside, 50-odd men sat around a long table, their voices hoarse from hours of argument. Benjamin Franklin adjusted his spectacles and tapped his cane against the floor. Thomas Jefferson, lanky and slow, read aloud the words he had written, words that would be copied, whispered, and shouted across the colonies. "We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal." The Declaration of Independence. As you watched them sign, you could see the fear in their eyes. They were committing treason against the crown. If they failed, the gallows awaited, yet their hands did not tremble. The voice was hushed now. They chose liberty over safety. They chose a country that did not yet exist. The years blurred together in a haze of war. You stood on the frozen banks of the Delaware River one Christmas night, as General George Washington led his men across the icy current. Their clothes were ragged, their boots worn through, yet they pushed forward, muskets slung over their shoulders, because the idea of freedom was worth every hardship. You rode through the fields at Saratoga, the gunfire deafening, smoke choking the air. You stood among the weary troops at Valley Forge, your breath fogging in the brutal Pennsylvania winter. And then Yorktown, 1781. The cannons thundered one final time, and the British laid down their arms. The impossible had happened. The colonies had won. The world shifted again. Now it was 1787, and you were back in Philadelphia. The war was over, but the question of how to govern this fragile new nation loomed larger than ever. Independence Hall was crowded once more, the air heavy with sweat and candle wax. The men debated for weeks, hammering out every word, every clause, until finally, a document was born, the Constitution of the United States. You could hear Alexander Hamilton's passionate voice rising above the din. You could see James Madison bent over his notes, his quill scratching furiously. And there, in the center of the room, was George Washington, chosen unanimously as the first president. The ink was barely dry when they realized how difficult it would be to keep this nation together, the voice said softly. But for now, they believed, and belief was enough. You stepped outside and felt the warm summer breeze against your face. The streets of Philadelphia were alive with celebration. Bells rang from the church towers. Children darted through the crowds, waving homemade flags, and shopkeepers threw open their doors to share bread and cider. A young mother stood on her porch, cradling a baby swaddled in a quilt. She looked out at the joyful throng and whispered, almost to herself, "He'll grow up free." The voice in your ear was quiet for a long time, letting the moment settle deep in your chest. "Remember this," it said finally. "This was the birth of a nation. But birth is only the beginning. To grow, they will have to expand, to push into lands unknown, and the choices they make will shape America forever." The world tilted again. You saw glimpses of what lay ahead, wagons rolling westward under a blazing sun, gold glinting in the streams of California, trains thundering across endless plains. "Next," the voice whispered, "you will travel with them. You will cross the frontier." And just like that, the candlelit streets of Philadelphia dissolved into wind and dust. Westward expansion and a nation divided. 1800, 1860. The sound of wagon wheels filled your ears, first wooden spokes creaking, iron rims grinding over stone and dirt. Then you felt the wind, dry, sharp, and endless. You opened your eyes to see a line of covered wagons stretching for nearly a mile. Families walked beside oxen pulling their entire lives westward. Barrels of flour, cast iron stoves, quilts, and keepsakes tied tight with rope. This was the Oregon Trail, one of many paths carved across the continent as Americans pushed west in search of land, fortune, and something they called manifest destiny, the belief that it was their right, even their duty, to claim the land that lay beyond the Mississippi River. You walked alongside a young father guiding the lead wagon. His boots were cracked, his shoulders sunburned, but he smiled when his little girl handed him a wildflower she'd picked from the prairie grass. At night, the travelers circled their wagons and built campfires that flickered against the star-drenched sky. Coyotes howled in the distance. Somewhere, a fiddle played a low, sweet tune. But this journey was no romantic adventure. You saw graves dug shallow by the roadside, marked only with a wooden cross. You saw river crossings go wrong, wagons tipping into the current, families screaming as the water swept away everything they owned. The voice in your ear was solemn. Every mile they traveled was paid for in sweat, and often in blood. You turned to see a group of Lakota riders watching from a hilltop. Their faces were unreadable, but you could feel the tension in the air. For them, this land was not empty, it was home, sacred and centuries old. Conflict was inevitable. You watched as skirmishes broke out. Treaties were signed and broken. Entire nations of indigenous people were forced to leave their ancestral lands along the Trail of Tears. And still, the wagons kept rolling. Time shifted again, and you found yourself standing in a bustling mining camp in the foothills of California. It was 1849, and gold fever had seized the nation. Men in rough shirts and suspenders panned for nuggets in icy streams, their hands numb from the cold water. Merchants sold shovels, whiskey, and hope at prices that grew higher by the day. This was the gold rush, a wild, chaotic scramble that transformed California almost overnight. America was growing fast, the voice murmured, but with growth came change. And not everyone agreed on what that change should look like. Now you were in the smoky heart of a textile mill in New England. The looms clattered so loudly you could barely hear yourself think. Young women worked the machines from dawn until dusk, their fingers raw from the spinning cotton. The Industrial Revolution had arrived, bringing trains that thundered across the countryside and telegraphs that sent messages faster than ever before. In the South, however, the economy still revolved around vast plantations of cotton and tobacco. You stood on one such plantation and saw the brutal reality behind its wealth. Enslaved men and women laboring from sunrise to sundown, their backs bent, their lives bound by chains and laws that denied their humanity. You followed one man under the cover of night as he slipped into the woods. He carried no lantern, only hope and a whispered promise that someone would guide him north to freedom. This was the Underground Railroad, a secret network of safe houses and brave souls like Harriet Tubman, whose steady hand and unshakable faith led hundreds of enslaved people to freedom. You saw the fury in the eyes of plantation owners who felt their way of life threatened. You heard the arguments echoing in Congress as the nation split ever deeper along a line no map could hide. The North and the South, the voice said gravely, were becoming two different worlds. One embraced free labor and rapid industry. The other clung to slavery. Calling it tradition, the divide grew wider with each passing year. You found yourself in a crowded tavern in Boston, where men pounded their fists on tables, denouncing the Fugitive Slave Act. Then you were in a parlor in Charleston, where planters swore they would never give up the system their fortunes depended on. Everywhere you turned, the air was thick with anger and fear. One night, you stood outside a farmhouse as a man read aloud from a new book, Uncle Tom's Cabin by Harriet Beecher Stowe. The crowd was silent, their faces pale in the lantern light. The story had awakened something in them, something that would not be ignored. The voice in your ear dropped to a whisper. They were heading toward a storm, one bigger than anything they could imagine. And you're about to step into it. The ground shook beneath you. The sound of distant cannon fire rumbled like thunder. Next, the voice said, you will hear the first shots of civil war. And once it begins, nothing will ever be the same again. The prairie wind howled one last time, and then it was gone. The Civil War and Reconstruction, 1861, 1877. The first cannon blast rattled your chest like thunder. Smoke rose thick over a green Virginia field where two great armies faced one another, the Union in blue, the Confederacy in gray. It was April 1861, and the Civil War had begun. You stood at the edge of the battlefield as musket fire cracked in rapid bursts, men shouting over the roar of cannon wheels. The air was a haze of gunpowder and fear. Soldiers barely older than boys clutched their rifles with trembling hands. This war, the voice whispered, was not only about preserving the Union, it was about the soul of the nation, about whether freedom would truly belong to all. Times shifted and you found yourself in Washington. See, the White House loomed before you, its windows glowing with late-night candlelight. Inside, a tall, weary man in a black suit leaned over a cluttered desk. Abraham Lincoln. He was writing words that would change the course of the war and the country. The Emancipation Proclamation. You watched his pen scratch across the parchment, his brow furrowed with the weight of the decision. On this day, the voice murmured, millions of enslaved men, women, and children were declared free. But freedom on paper was not freedom in reality. That would still have to be fought for. Back on the battlefield, you marched alongside Union soldiers through the mud at Gettysburg, Pennsylvania. Cannon shells exploded so close you could feel the ground shake beneath your boots. You saw medics rushing wounded men to makeshift field hospitals, barns, and churches, converted into places of mercy. For 3 bloody days, the fight raged. When it was over, the fields were silent but for the cries of the dying. Lincoln stood at the cemetery that November and spoke words that would be remembered forever. That government of the people, by the people, for the people, shall not perish from the earth. The war dragged on for 2 more brutal years. You crossed rivers with General Ulysses S. Grant's army, watched the Confederacy crumble city by city. And finally, in April 1865, You stood outside the courthouse at Appomattox as General Robert E. Lee surrendered. The Union had been preserved. Slavery, in law, was ended. But victory was not triumph. Now, the voice said softly, they had to heal. You were in the South again, but the battlefields were quiet now. Fields lay in ruin. Railroads were twisted wreckage. Entire towns had been burned to the ground. Freedmen, men and women who had been enslaved just months earlier, walked dusty roads in search of family members, jobs, and a place to begin anew. Many carried nothing but the clothes on their backs and a fierce will to survive. The federal government sent troops and officials to enforce new civil rights laws, to rebuild schools and communities, but not everyone welcomed them. One night, you stood beneath the shadow of a burning cross. A hooded mob rode past on horseback, torches in hand, the Ku Klux Klan. They terrorized newly freed black citizens and anyone who dared support them, determined to maintain the old order. The wounds of war, the voice whispered, cut deep, and some would rather reopen them than see the country change. You visited a classroom in a rebuilt church where a young black girl carefully traced letters on a slate board. For the first time in her life, she was learning to read. Outside, her father worked long hours rebuilding a cabin on land he now owned. Though the work was hard and the future uncertain, there was hope here, but it was fragile. Political battles raged in Washington over how much power the southern states should regain, how far the federal government should go to protect civil rights. Gradually, the will to enforce Reconstruction faded. By 1877, federal troops withdrew from the South, leaving many of the promises of freedom unfulfilled. You felt the weight of it as you walked past newly erected monuments that glorified the lost cause, as black voters were pushed from the polls through fear and violence. But you also saw resilience. Communities of formerly enslaved people built churches, schools, and businesses despite the odds. They held on to the belief that one day, America might truly keep its promise of liberty and justice for all. The voice in your ear was quiet now. This war tested the very idea of America, it said, and though the Union survived, the questions it raised about equality and justice would echo for generations. You looked up at the night sky over a South still scarred by conflict. Somewhere beyond those stars lay the next chapter. The frontier is closing, the voice continued. The West calls with the promise of freedom and fortune. But even there, the nation's growing pains will not be left behind. The ground shifted beneath you one more time. You caught glimpses of cowboys driving cattle under a blazing Texas sun, of trains cutting across endless plains, of native nations standing their ground as the tide of settlers swept ever closer. Next, the voice whispered, you will ride into the Wild West, and you will see how America's hunger for expansion would shape its soul. The Wild West and the Age of Industry, 1877, 1900. The sun beat down hard, turning the Texas plains into shimmering waves of heat. You stood in the middle of a dusty trail as cowboys rode past on horseback, their wide-brimmed hats pulled low, whips cracking as they herded longhorn cattle toward the nearest railhead. The cattle drive could last weeks, hundreds of miles across open country where storms, rustlers, and stampedes threatened at every turn. This was the Wild West, vast, untamed, and alive with possibility. At night, the cowboys sat around campfires, the smell of coffee and wood smoke hanging in the still air. Someone strummed a guitar, another hummed an old folk tune. The stars stretched forever above, brighter than you'd ever seen. But the West was not empty. You rode further north and saw the teepees of a Sioux encampment near the Little Bighorn River. Families prepared meals, children played, elders told stories passed down through generations. This land had been theirs long before the first wagon train rolled across it. The voice in your ear grew heavy. The clash was inevitable. You watched as cavalry units advanced, rifles at the ready, determined to push native nations onto reservations. The Battle of Little Bighorn erupted in a frenzy of gunfire and chaos. You caught glimpses of Sitting Bull and Crazy Horse, leaders fighting not just for their people, but for the very survival of their way of life. The West was changing fast. The completion of the Transcontinental Railroad stitched the continent together, making it possible to travel from New York to San Francisco in less than a week. Towns sprang up overnight along the tracks, some thriving, others vanishing as quickly as they had come. You stopped in one of these boom towns, its saloons and gambling halls packed with miners, traders, and drifters hoping to strike it rich. A gunfight erupted in the dusty main street, and within seconds, the crowd went back to drinking and playing cards as if nothing had happened. But beneath the myths of cowboys and lawmen, the reality was harsher. Poverty, violence, and the slow disappearance of the native cultures that had flourished here for centuries. By the 1890s, the voice whispered, the frontier had closed. The era of the Wild West was ending. But America's hunger for growth, that was only beginning. The world shifted once more. Now you were standing at the docks of Ellis Island, watching steamships unload wave after wave of immigrants from Italy, Ireland, Germany, and Eastern Europe. Families clutched suitcases in children's hands as they shuffled through inspection lines, their eyes wide with exhaustion and hope. In the distance, the Statue of Liberty rose against the New York skyline, her torch a beacon for those who dreamed of a better life. But for many, the streets were not paved with gold. You followed a family into a tenement on Manhattan's Lower East Side, climbing narrow staircases that reeked of coal smoke and sewage. Entire families crowded into a single room, sewing piecework by candlelight just to afford the next day's bread. The factories they worked in were loud, dangerous places where accidents were common and wages barely enough to survive. Children as young as 8 stood on tiptoe to reach the machines, their faces smeared with soot and sweat. You walked through Chicago, Pittsburgh, and Detroit, where smokestacks blackened the sky and rail cars carried steel, coal and oil to every corner of the country. This, the voice said, was the rise of industrial America. You met the men who built empires in this new age. Andrew Carnegie, whose steel mills fueled the construction of bridges and skyscrapers. John D. Rockefeller, who turned oil into a commodity that powered a nation. Thomas Edison, whose electric light bulbs began to banish the dark from American homes. But you also saw the cost. Workers toiled 12-hour shifts, 6 days a week. For pennies, strikes erupted across the country, met with violence from police and private militias. The gap between the wealthy elite and the struggling poor grew wider by the day. One night, you stood in the middle of Union Square in New York City as thousands of laborers marched with banners demanding fair wages and safe working conditions. A young organizer climbed onto a wooden crate and shouted, "If we don't stand together, we will fall apart." The voice in your ear softened. America was standing at a crossroads. Industry had made it powerful, but it had also made it restless. Immigrants brought new ideas, new cultures, and new conflicts. The nation was more connected than ever, but also more divided in ways that could not be ignored. You saw the Chicago World's Fair of 1893, where electric lights illuminated gleaming white buildings that seemed to promise a bright future. You saw farmers struggling as big corporations and banks squeezed them dry. You saw segregation laws harden in the South, erasing many of the gains won during Reconstruction. And finally, you stood in a quiet park as the century drew to a close. The Statue of Liberty gleamed in the distance. Somewhere nearby, a phonograph played a scratchy tune. The United States, the voice said, was no longer a fragile experiment. It was a rising power. But the challenges of the new century would test it in ways no one could yet imagine. You felt the box of artifacts in your hands again, the photograph, the journal, the compass, and realized you had reached the end of this first journey through time, but not the end of the story. The attic came back into focus, the rain still pattering gently on the roof above you. The voice spoke one last time. These were the first 3 centuries of America's story. The wars, the hopes, the mistakes, the triumphs, they shaped the nation you know today. But history never stops. Will you follow it into the next century? Will you see how America faced 2 world wars, a civil rights revolution, and a new era of technology that would change the world forever? The attic light flickered, and then the voice asked, almost tenderly, "Are you ready to open the box again?" Asterisk. You open your eyes and the attic slowly comes back into focus. The box still rests in front of you, glowing softly in the dim light. You've just walked through over 300 years of American history in a single journey, but you've only seen the surface. Inside this box are more artifacts, more stories waiting for you. 12 full episodes, each one will take you deeper into the moments, the people, and the choices that shape this nation. If you felt the wind of the frontier on your face, If you've heard the gunfire of revolution echo in your chest, you won't want to miss what comes next. Follow this series, step through every doorway, and experience the history of the United States as if you were truly there. Because the story isn't finished yet, and neither are you. Asterisk.